The champagne flute trembled in my hand as I stood on the terrace of the hotel ballroom, watching the city lights blur through tears I refused to let fall. Behind me, laughter and congratulations echoed through the reception hall. My classmates were celebrating the culmination of 4 brutal years of medical school. The sleepless nights, the impossible exams, the patients we'd saved, and the ones we couldn't. But I wasn't celebrating. I was replaying the moment that happened 2 hours ago, over and over, like a record stuck on the worst possible note. You're still a failure, Maya. You just have a fancy piece of paper now. My father's voice, cold, dismissive, delivered in front of my entire family right after I'd walked across that stage and received my medical degree. Let me back up. My name is Dr. Maya Reeves, and this is the story of how I went from being my father's biggest disappointment to the one person who held his life in her hands. Growing up, I was always the other daughter, not the pretty one, not the charming one, not the one who made my parents proud. That was my older sister, Natalie. She was everything I wasn't: outgoing, effortlessly beautiful, interested in the right things. By the time I was 10, the pattern was set. Natalie got the attention, I got the leftovers. My father, Richard Reeves, was a real estate developer. Self-made, he liked to remind everyone, started with nothing, built an empire. He wore expensive suits and drove expensive cars and expected his children to reflect his success. Natalie obliged. She married a lawyer from a good family, had 2 perfect children, hosted charity galas, and looked stunning in every family photo. I, on the other hand, was a bookworm. Quiet, serious. I preferred spending Saturday nights studying anatomy textbooks to attending the country club events my father insisted were networking opportunities. When I told him at 16 that I wanted to be a doctor, specifically a cardiothoracic surgeon, he laughed. Maya, sweetheart, you don't have the personality for medicine. Doctors need to be personable. People need to trust them. But I'm good at science, I'd protested, my voice small even to my own ears. Being good at something and being successful at something are 2 different things, he said, returning to his newspaper. Maybe nursing. That would suit you better. I never forgot that moment. The casual dismissal, the way he didn't even look at me when he gutted my dreams. But I didn't let it stop me. I got into a good pre-med program on a partial scholarship. Not Harvard, not Yale, but a solid state university with an excellent medical school pipeline. My father attended exactly one parents' weekend in 4 years. He spent the entire time comparing my campus to the private college Natalie had attended, pointing out everything that was lacking. Well, it's not exactly impressive, but I suppose it'll do, he'd say to my mother, loud enough for me to hear. My mother, Patricia, was gentler. She tried in her way, but she'd spent 30 years deferring to my father's opinions. When he decided I wasn't worth the investment, she went along with it. Not out of cruelty, I don't think, but out of habit. Your father just wants what's best for you, dear. He doesn't think medicine is a good fit for your temperament. Translation: he doesn't think you're good enough. I stopped trying to win his approval somewhere around my junior year. Instead, I channeled everything into my grades. I graduated summa cum laude, I scored in the 99th percentile on the MCAT, and I got into Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. When I called to tell my parents, my mother gasped with genuine joy. My father said, "Well, let's hope you can actually finish this time." I hadn't dropped out of anything. He just assumed I would fail. Medical school nearly killed me, not figuratively, literally. The workload was inhuman. 20-hour days, endless rotations, patients who died despite everything we did. I watched classmates drop out, have nervous breakdowns, develop substance abuse problems. The attrition rate was brutal. But I survived. I didn't just survive, I excelled. I was at the top of my class, I published research, I assisted on complex surgeries as a third-year student. My professor started talking about me as a future star in cardiac surgery. I had everything I'd worked for within reach. And through it all, my father remained unimpressed. He didn't visit, not once in 4 years. When I invited him to my white coat ceremony, he said he had a business meeting. When I called to tell him I'd been selected for a prestigious research fellowship, he cut me off mid-sentence. "That's nice, Maya. Listen, I'm about to tee off. Can we talk later?" We didn't talk later. Natalie, meanwhile, was having her third child. My father flew across the country to be there for the birth. He posted photos on Facebook, beaming, holding his new grandson. The caption read, "Blessed to have such a wonderful family." I wasn't in any of the photos. The day I graduated from medical school should have been the proudest day of my life. 4 years of hell, thousands of hours of study, countless sacrifices. I made it. I was officially Maya Reeves, MD. My mother insisted they come to the ceremony. For once, she put her foot down. "Richard, this is important. She's worked so hard." He agreed, but I could tell he resented it. They sat in the back of the auditorium. I saw them when I walked across that stage, my mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, my father checking his phone. Natalie didn't come. She had a PTA meeting or hair appointment or something equally critical. After the ceremony, there was a reception. My closest friends from medical school were there, their families taking photos, crying happy tears, celebrating. I introduced my parents to my best friend, Lena, and her family. "Congratulations, Dr. Reeves," Lena's mother said, hugging me tightly. "Your parents must be so proud." I looked at my father, hoping, stupidly, for some acknowledgement, some small sign that he recognized what I'd accomplished. He smiled thinly. "Well, she finally finished something." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Lena's mother's smile froze. My mother looked at the floor. I felt my face burn. "Dad, I just graduated medical school. Johns Hopkins, top 10% of my class." "I'm aware, but medical school's just the beginning, Maya. Residency is where people wash out. And surgical residency," he shook his head, "that's a whole different level. You're not known for handling pressure well." Something inside me snapped. Not known for handling pressure well? I repeated, my voice shaking. I just survived 4 years of one of the most rigorous programs in the world. I've worked 100-hour weeks. I've held human hearts in my hands. I've watched people die and had to tell their families. What exactly do you think I can't handle? My father's expression didn't change. "You're being dramatic. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're too emotional for surgery. Surgeons need to be cold, clinical. You fall apart at the smallest criticism." The smallest criticism? Tears were streaming down my face now, and I hated myself for it. Hated that he was right about this one thing, that I couldn't control my emotions when it came to him. But he just stood there, unmoved, as if he'd simply stated an objective fact. "You're still a failure, Maya. You just have a fancy piece of paper now." Then he turned and walked away. My mother hesitated, looked at me with something like pity, and followed him. I stood there in my graduation gown, surrounded by celebration, completely alone. I didn't speak to my father for 3 months after graduation. I threw myself into my residency at Mass General Hospital in Boston, one of the best surgical programs in the country. The hours were even worse than medical school, regularly pulling 30-hour shifts, but I welcomed the exhaustion. It meant I didn't have time to think about that day. My mother called occasionally, making excuses. "Your father didn't mean it that way, sweetheart. He just worries about you. Surgery is so demanding." "Mom, he called me a failure at my medical school graduation."
He was stressed. The business hasn't been doing well. You know how he gets. I stopped answering her calls. Natalie reached out once, a text message. "Dad said you're not talking to them. Don't you think you're being a little dramatic? He's our father." I blocked her number. The truth was, Cutting them off hurt less than I expected. I'd been preparing for it my whole life in a way. They'd been emotionally absent for so long that their physical absence barely registered. What registered was the relief. No more waiting for my father's approval. No more hoping that this achievement, this accomplishment would finally be enough. I poured everything into work. Cardiac surgery became my entire world. The heart, I learned, was both more complex and more simple than people realized. It was a pump, elegant in its mechanics, and when it failed, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. There was no room for doubt in the operating room, no space for emotion. You had to be perfect or people died. My father thought I was too emotional for surgery. I became the most controlled, focused surgeon in my program. My attending physicians started using me as an example. Dr. Reeves doesn't rattle, one of them said, during a particularly complex valve replacement. Ice in her veins. If only he knew what it cost me to achieve that ice. 18 months into my residency, I received a letter from my father's law firm. Not from my father, from his lawyers. I almost threw it away unopened. The letter informed me that my father was updating his will and estate planning. As part of this process, he wanted to clarify the distribution of assets among his heirs. Attached was a document showing that Natalie would receive 80% of his estate, while I would receive 20%. The letter explained that this was in recognition of Natalie's greater contributions to family cohesion and her alignment with family values. I read it 3 times, waiting for the hurt to come. It didn't. Instead, I felt something closer to vindication. This was who he was. This was who he'd always been. At least now it was on paper. I signed the acknowledgement form and sent it back without comment. 2 weeks later, my mother called in tears. "Maya, please, he didn't mean it that way. He's just trying to be fair. Natalie has children, she has expenses." "Mom, it's fine," I said, and I meant it. He can do whatever he wants with his money. "But you're his daughter too." "Am I?" The words came out harsher than I intended, because he's made it pretty clear for about 27 years that I'm not the daughter he wanted. She started crying harder. I softened my tone. "Mom, I'm not angry, I promise. I'm just done. I'm done trying to be someone he could be proud of. I'm done waiting for him to see me. I'm a good doctor. My patients see me. My colleagues see me. That's enough." It was the last real conversation we had for 2 years. By my 4th year of residency, I was operating independently on complex cases. My hands were steady. My decisions were sound. I'd had patients die because that's what happens in cardiac surgery, but I'd also saved dozens of lives. I'd held failing hearts in my hands and brought them back to life. I'd also developed a reputation. Dr. Reeves is brilliant but cold, I'd overheard a nurse say once. She's like a robot in the OR. I didn't correct her. Being a robot was safer than being the emotional wreck my father thought I was. I was finishing a double shift when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Boston area code. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Is this Dr. Maya Reeves?" A woman's voice, professional, clipped. "Yes." "This is Beth calling from Boston General Cardiology. I'm calling regarding your father, Richard Reeves. He's been admitted with acute coronary syndrome." The floor tilted, just slightly. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your mother listed you as next of kin. Your father had a significant cardiac event this morning. We've stabilized him for now, but he needs a cardiac catheterization, possibly more. Can you come in?" I looked at the clock. 3:47 a.m. I'd been awake for 31 hours. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I heard myself say. Boston General was 15 minutes from Mass General where I worked. I knew the building, knew the doctors, had rotated through their cardiac unit as a 3rd-year resident. When I walked into the cardiology ICU, still in my scrubs from my own hospital, the night nurse recognized me. "Dr. Reeves? I heard. I'm so sorry. He's in Bay 7. I nodded, my throat tight, and walked down the corridor. Through the glass walls, I could see my mother slumped in a chair beside a hospital bed. She looked smaller than I remembered, grayer, older. She was holding my father's hand. I stopped outside the door, looking at him for the first time in nearly 3 years. Richard Reeves had always been larger than life, commanding, intimidating. The man in the hospital bed looked neither. He was pale, diminished, with IV lines running into both arms and a nasal cannula delivering oxygen. The monitors above his bed showed an irregular heart rhythm. Atrial fibrillation, my doctor brain noted automatically. Elevated troponin levels indicating cardiac damage. My mother looked up and saw me. Her face crumpled. "Maya," she whispered, standing so fast her chair scraped against the floor. She rushed to me and threw her arms around me, sobbing into my shoulder. "Oh, Maya, thank God you're here. Thank God you're here." I held her stiffly, my eyes still on my father. He was awake, I realized. His eyes were open, looking at me. For once, he wasn't checking his phone or looking past me or dismissing me. He was looking directly at me, and there was something in his expression I'd never seen before. Fear. "What happened?" I asked my mother gently. I extracted myself from her embrace. "He collapsed at the office. They said it was a heart attack. Maya, they said..." She broke. "They said it's bad. They need to do tests, but they think his arteries are blocked. They said he might need surgery." I nodded slowly. "Has cardiology been by yet?" "Yes, Dr. Chen. He said they'd do a catheterization in the morning to see how bad the blockages are. He said something about stents, maybe bypass surgery." She looked at me desperately. "Maya, you're a surgeon. You know about hearts. Is he going to die?" It was surreal, standing there in my scrubs, being asked to translate medical reality from my mother about my father's failing heart. The father who told me I wasn't cut out for medicine. The father who called me a failure. "The catheterization will show us more," I said carefully. "But Mom, acute coronary syndrome is serious. The next 48 hours are critical." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Will you stay, please? I know things have been difficult, but he's your father. I can't do this alone." I looked at him again. He was still staring at me, but he hadn't spoken. His oxygen saturation was low, I noted from the monitor. His blood pressure was borderline. He looked, for the first time in my life, vulnerable. "I'll stay," I said quietly.
I called my chief resident and explained the situation. She was sympathetic, told me to take whatever time I needed. Then I settled into the uncomfortable chair on the opposite side of my father's bed and waited. My mother dozed fitfully. My father drifted in and out of consciousness. I watched the monitors, my trained eye catching every irregularity, every concerning dip or spike. At one point, his rhythm deteriorated enough that I called the nurse. They adjusted his medications, and the rhythm stabilized. Around 6 a.m., Natalie arrived. She swept into the room like she owned it. Designer purse, perfect hair, an expression of dramatic concern. "Oh my God, Daddy," she said, rushing to the bedside and grabbing his free hand. "I came as soon as I heard. Are you okay? What did the doctor say?" She hadn't even acknowledged my presence. "The doctor said he needs a cardiac catheterization," I said evenly. "They'll assess the blockages and determine if he needs stents or bypass surgery." Natalie's head whipped around, noticing me for the first time. Her eyes widened. "Maya? What are you doing here?" "I'm here because Mom called me." "But I thought you two weren't speaking." "We weren't," I said, "but he had a heart attack, so I came." Something flickered across her face. Resentment, maybe, or confusion. She'd never understood why I'd cut contact with our parents. In her world, family was family, and you overlook things like emotional abuse because that's just how Dad is. "Well," she said, recovering her composure, "it's good that you're here, I guess. Daddy, don't worry. Everything is going to be fine. You're strong. You're going to beat this. Our father's eyes moved from her to me and back again. He still hadn't spoken. Has he said anything? Natalie asked Mom. Mom shook her head. He's been mostly sleeping. The sedatives, I think. The sedatives were wearing off, though. I could see it in his increasing alertness, the way his eyes tracked movement, the slight increase in his respiratory rate. He was aware, just not speaking. At 8 a.m., Dr. Chen arrived with the catheterization team. Mr. Reeves, he said, checking the chart, we're going to take you down to the cath lab now. We'll run a small camera through your arteries to see where the blockages are. It's a relatively simple procedure, and you'll be awake for it. He glanced at me and nodded in recognition. Dr. Reeves, I didn't realize Richard was your father. Small world, I said neutrally. Dr. Chen was a good cardiologist, skilled and thorough. I trusted him. But I also knew what they were going to find just from looking at my father's history, the symptoms, the enzyme levels. This wasn't going to be a simple stent job. We'll have results in a few hours, Dr. Chen said. The waiting room is down the hall. We'll come find you as soon as we're done. They wheeled my father away. My mother followed them to the hallway, reluctant to let him out of her sight. Natalie checked her phone. I need to call David, she referred to her husband. Let him know what's happening. Are you going to stay or do you have to get back to work? I'm staying, I said. She looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. You know, Maya, I know you and Dad have had your issues, but he really does love you. He's just not good at showing it. The words were so absurd, so disconnected from reality, that I almost laughed. But then I saw that she actually believed it. In Natalie's world, our father was a tough but loving man who had high standards. She'd never been on the receiving end of his contempt, so she couldn't conceive of it. Sure, I said, because there was no point in arguing. The catheterization took 90 minutes. I spent that time in the surgical waiting room going over charts for my own patients on my tablet, trying to distract myself. My mother sat beside me, clutching her rosary and praying silently. Natalie paced, making phone calls, updating relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. When Dr. Chen finally appeared, his expression told me everything I needed to know before he said a word. Mrs. Reeves, he said, pulling up a chair, the catheterization showed extensive disease. Your husband has 3 major blockages, one in the left anterior descending artery, one in the right coronary artery, and one in the circumflex artery. These are critical blockages, over 90% occluded. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. What does that mean? It means he needs open heart surgery, I said quietly. Coronary artery bypass grafting. CABG. Dr. Chen nodded. Dr. Reeves is correct. We need to bypass these blockages using grafts from other blood vessels. It's a major surgery, but it's his best chance. His only chance, I added, unable to help myself. When? My mother asked, her voice shaking. As soon as possible. Given the severity and the risk of another cardiac event, we'd like to schedule it for tomorrow morning. I've already spoken with Dr. Harrison, our chief of cardiac surgery. He's one of the best in the country. Natalie leaned forward. Is there any risk? I mean, what are the chances that something goes wrong? Dr. Chen's face was carefully neutral. All surgery carries risk, especially cardiac surgery. But your father is relatively stable right now, and the surgery is necessary. Without it, he won't survive more than a few weeks, if that. The room went silent except for my mother's soft crying. We need to prepare him for surgery, Dr. Chen continued. There are consent forms, preoperative procedures. We'll bring him back to the ICU shortly, and the surgical team will meet with him and with you to go over everything. After he left, my mother turned to me with desperate eyes. Maya, you're a surgeon. You do this, don't you? Heart surgery. I'm a resident, I said carefully. I assist on surgeries, and I've done some independently, but But you know about this. You know if this is the right thing to do. I took a breath. Mom, the catheterization results are clear. He has triple vessel disease. Without bypass surgery, he'll have another heart attack, probably fatal. The surgery is risky, but it's his only option.
And this Dr. Harrison, is he good? He's excellent, I said honestly. I've assisted him on dozens of cases. He's technically brilliant. What I didn't say, Dr. Harrison also had a 20% complication rate on high-risk cases. My father, with his age, his extensive disease, and his recent MI, was high risk. They brought my father back to the ICU around noon. He was more alert now, the sedation from the catheterization wearing off. When he saw the three of us waiting, his eyes found mine first. We stared at each other for a long moment, and I wondered what he was thinking. If he was thinking about the graduation, about everything he'd said. The surgical team arrived an hour later. Dr. Harrison, his resident, and a nurse with consent forms. Dr. Harrison was in his 60s, silver-haired with the supreme confidence of a surgeon who'd done this procedure thousands of times. "Mr. Reeves," he said, shaking my father's hand, "I'm Dr. Harrison. I'll be performing your bypass surgery tomorrow morning. I understand Dr. Chen explained what we found." My father nodded, his voice raspy when he spoke for the first time. "3 blockages. Need surgery." "That's right. We're going to take vessels from your leg and chest and use them to bypass the blocked areas in your heart. The surgery will take about 4 to 6 hours. You'll be on a heart-lung machine during the procedure, and then we'll have you in cardiac ICU for a few days afterward. Full recovery takes several months, but most patients do well." "What are the risks?" my father asked, his eyes sharp despite his weakened state. Dr. Harrison didn't sugarcoat it. "The main risks are bleeding, infection, stroke, and heart attack during or after surgery. There's also a small risk of death. In your case, given the extent of disease and your recent MI, I'd put your mortality risk at about 15%. 15%. 1 in 7 chance my father would die on the table." My mother gasped. Natalie reached for my father's hand. "However," Dr. Harrison continued, "without surgery, your risk of death in the next few weeks is nearly 100%. The choice, from a medical standpoint, is clear." My father was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he asked, "And after, if I survive the surgery, what's my life going to look like?" "With proper rehabilitation and lifestyle changes, most patients return to a good quality of life. You'll need to stop smoking if you smoke, change your diet, exercise regularly, but you can live a normal life." "I don't smoke. Diet could be better." "We'll work on that," Dr. Harrison said with a small smile. He pulled out the consent forms. "I need you to sign these when you're ready. They authorize us to perform the surgery and acknowledge that you understand the risks." My father took the pen, but his hand was shaking. Not from fear, I realized, but from the strain on his cardiovascular system. His body was failing, shutting down from lack of oxygen. Natalie helped him sign, guiding his hand. After the surgical team left, my mother fussed over him, adjusting his blankets, asking if he needed anything. Natalie pulled out her phone to make more calls. I stood by the window, looking out at the city, feeling strangely disconnected from the scene. "Maya." My father's voice, quiet but clear. I turned. He was looking at me, his eyes more vulnerable than I'd ever seen them. "Yes?" "Can you—" He paused, gathering strength. "Can you stay for the surgery?" The request was so unexpected that I didn't know how to respond. My mother and Natalie were both looking at me now. "Of course she'll stay," my mother said quickly. "She's your daughter." But my father kept his eyes on me, waiting for my answer. "I'll stay," I said finally. He nodded, and something in his expression eased just slightly. Then he closed his eyes, exhausted. That evening, I sent Natalie and my mother home to rest.
They'd been at the hospital for nearly 24 hours, and they needed sleep. I promised to call if anything changed. After they left, I sat in the dimmed ICU bay, listening to the rhythmic beeping of monitors. My father slept fitfully, occasionally waking and looking around with confusion before settling again, standard for ICU patients. The disorientation, the disrupted sleep, the constant noise and light. Around 10 p.m., he woke and looked at me, more lucid than before. "You're still here," he said, his voice rough. I said I would be. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're a doctor now." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Yes, I'm in my 5th year of surgical residency. Cardiac surgery. Yes." Another pause. "That's difficult." "It is." I could see him struggling with something, words he didn't know how to form. Richard Reeves, who'd always had an opinion about everything, who'd never struggled to tell me how disappointing I was, suddenly couldn't speak. Finally, he said, "I was wrong." The words were so quiet, I almost missed them. "What?" "At your graduation, I was wrong." He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw regret in his eyes. "You're not a failure. You never were." The words should have meant something. They should have healed something, but all I felt was tired. "Why did you say it then?" I asked softly. He closed his eyes. "Because I was angry. Scared." "Scared of what?" "Of you being better than me." The admission seemed to cost him something. "You were always smarter than Natalie, harder working, more driven. And you wanted something I couldn't understand. I built things with my hands, with my business sense. You wanted to build with your mind, save lives. I didn't know how to relate to that, so I pushed you away instead." I sat back in my chair, processing this. "You pushed me away because I threatened you?" "I pushed you away because I didn't know how to be proud of you without feeling small myself." He opened his eyes, and they were red. "And now I'm lying here, and my life is in the hands of people like you, surgeons who do things I can't even comprehend, and I realize how stupid I was, how much time I wasted." My throat was tight. "Dad, I'm sorry," he said, and his voice broke. "I'm sorry for what I said at your graduation. I'm sorry for it all, for making you feel like you weren't enough. You were always enough. I just couldn't see it." The tears I'd been holding back for 3 years finally came. Not sobs, just quiet tears running down my cheeks while I sat there looking at my father, this man who'd hurt me so deeply and who was now, finally, seeing me. "I forgive you," I whispered. He reached out with a trembling hand, and I took it. We sat like that for a long time, father and daughter, holding hands in the dim light of the ICU, the monitors beeping steadily, the night stretching on around us. The surgical team came for him at 6 a.m. My mother and Natalie had returned at 5:30 a.m., clutching coffees and looking exhausted. We walked beside the gurney as they wheeled him toward the OR, my mother holding one of his hands, me walking on the other side. At the double doors to the surgical suite, we had to stop. My father looked at each of us, his eyes lingering on my mother longest. He said to her, "I love you." She whispered, "I love you too," kissing his forehead. "I'll be right here when you wake up." He looked at Natalie. "Take care of your mother." "I will, Daddy." Then he looked at me. "Maya?" "I know," I said, squeezing his hand. "I'll be here too." The doors swung open, and they wheeled him through. The last thing I saw was his hand reaching back towards us, and then he was gone.
There is a particular kind of hell that is waiting while someone you love is in surgery. You know intellectually what's happening. In my case, I knew exactly what was happening. could picture every step: the median sternotomy, the careful spreading of the ribs, the moment they'd stop his heart and put him on bypass, the delicate work of grafting new vessels, the moment they'd shock his heart back to life. But knowing the steps doesn't make the waiting easier. We settled in the surgical waiting room, a bland space with uncomfortable chairs and a TV no one watched. Natalie made phone calls. My mother prayed. I paced, unable to sit still, my mind running through everything that could go wrong. At the 2-hour mark, a nurse came out to update us. The surgery is progressing well. They've placed him on bypass and are working on the first graft. At 4 hours, they've completed all 3 grafts. Now they're warming his heart and preparing to take him off bypass. This was the critical moment, the moment when they'd restart his heart and see if it could function on its own with the new blood flow. If the heart was too damaged, if the grafts didn't work, if there was any complication, I stopped pacing and stared at the clock. 11:47 a.m. 11:52. 11:58. At 12:03, Dr. Harrison came through the doors, still in his surgical scrubs and cap. We all stood up, my mother's hand flying to her throat. "The surgery went well," he said, and my mother's knees buckled with relief. Natalie caught her. We completed all 3 bypasses. His heart responded well when we took him off the machine. He's stable right now, and we're taking him to cardiac ICU. He'll be sedated for the next few hours, but you should be able to see him this afternoon. "Is he going to be okay?" my mother asked, her voice shaking. "The surgery is only the first step," Dr. Harrison said honestly. "The next 72 hours are critical. We need to make sure he doesn't develop complications, infections, bleeding, cardiac events. But his vital signs look good. He came through the surgery better than I expected." He looked at me. "Dr. Reeves, can I speak to you for a moment?" I followed him into the hallway, my heart pounding. "I wanted to tell you," he said quietly, "that I know this isn't easy having family in surgery, especially when you know exactly what can go wrong. But you should know that your father did well. His heart is stronger than the imaging suggested. I think he's going to make it." "Thank you," I said, and meant it. "Also," he added, "I looked at your record after I realized Richard was your father. Your surgical evaluations are exceptional. When you finish residency, if you're interested in staying at Mass General, I'd like to talk to you about joining the cardiac surgery team." I stared at him. Dr. Harrison was offering me a job, one of the most coveted positions in cardiac surgery in the country. I thank you. I'd like that." He nodded and headed back toward the OR. I stood in the hallway for a moment, letting it all sink in. My father had survived, and somewhere in the midst of this crisis, I'd been offered my dream job. They let us see him that evening. He was in a private ICU bay, surrounded by machines and monitors, a ventilator tube still down his throat. His chest was bandaged, drainage tubes emerging from beneath the dressings. He looked small, fragile, nothing like the commanding figure I'd grown up fearing. My mother sat beside him, holding his hand and crying softly. Natalie stood at the foot of the bed, looking uncomfortable with all the medical equipment. I checked his monitors automatically, noting his heart rhythm, his oxygen saturation, his blood pressure. All stable. Good. Over the next few days, I split my time between my residency at Mass General and visiting my father at Boston General. They extubated him on day 2, and he was able to speak, though he was weak and his voice was rough. "Maya," he said when I visited that evening, "you came." "Of course I came." "You have your own patients. You don't have to keep coming here." "I want to," I said simply. And I did.
Not out of obligation, but because something had shifted between us that night before his surgery. The wall I'd built to protect myself from his judgment had cracked, and I found that I wanted to be there for him, wanted to see him recover. He improved steadily. By day 5, he was sitting up. By day 7, he was walking short distances with physical therapy. The cardiac rehabilitation team worked with him on diet and exercise plans. On day 10, they moved him out of ICU to regular cardiac floor. My mother had barely left her side, and she looked exhausted but happy. "The doctors say he can go home in a few days," she told me, her eyes shining. "And Maya, he's different. He's been different since the surgery. He talks to me more. He actually listens." I noticed it too. My father was quieter, more introspective. He asked questions about my work, genuine questions, listening to the answers. He apologized to my mother for things he'd done years ago. He called Natalie and had a long conversation with her about being a better grandfather. Natalie told me afterward, "I don't know what happened to him, but it's like he's a different person." Near-death experiences can do that, I said. But I thought it was more than that. I thought he'd been given a second chance, and he was determined not to waste it. 2 days before he was discharged, I visited in the evening after my shift. My mother and Natalie had gone home to rest. It was just the two of us, and my father was sitting in the chair by the window, looking out at the lights of Boston. "You should be resting," I said, pulling up a chair. "I've been resting for 2 weeks. I'm tired of resting." I smiled. "That's a good sign." He looked at me, his expression serious. "Maya, I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish." I nodded, suddenly nervous. Before the surgery, when I was lying there in the ICU, I kept thinking about all the things I'd done wrong, all the ways I'd failed, not in business, but as a father. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Before Natalie was born, she was easy. She wanted the things I understood: security, comfort, social status. I could give her those things. But you wanted intangible things: knowledge, purpose, to make a difference. And I didn't know how to give you that, so I convinced myself it wasn't worth giving, that you were wrong for wanting it." His eyes were wet now. "But you weren't wrong. You were right. And you pursued it anyway, even when I told you that you couldn't, that you weren't good enough. You became a doctor. You became a surgeon. You're saving lives, Maya. And I'm so proud of you that I don't have words for it." The tears I'd been holding back spilled over. "You're proud of me?" "I've always been proud of you," he said, his voice breaking. "I was just too stupid and too scared to say it. And now I'm an old man who almost died, and I'm realizing I've wasted so much time, so many years I could have spent knowing you, being part of your life, supporting you." He reached out and took my hand. "I know I can't get those years back. I know I hurt you, probably too much to ever fully fix. But if you'll let me, I'd like to try. I'd like to be the father you deserved all along." I was crying openly now, unable to speak. "I'm not asking you to forget what I did," he continued, "or even to completely forgive me. I'm just asking for a chance to do better, to be better." I squeezed his hand, trying to find my voice. "You don't have to ask, Dad. You already have it. You've had it since you apologized that night before surgery." He pulled me into a hug, and we sat there, crying together, father and daughter, finally, truly connected. My father's recovery was long and difficult, but he approached it with a determination I'd never seen in him before. He followed every recommendation from his cardiac rehabilitation team. He changed his diet, started exercising, quit the business practices that had kept him stressed for decades. He retired from active management of his real estate company and handed the reins to his business partner. Life's too short, he told me over lunch one day, 3 months after his surgery. I spent 40 years building something to prove I was worth something. But I know now that my worth isn't in buildings or money. It's in relationships, in being there for the people I love. He and my mother started traveling, taking the trips they'd always put off. He came to visit me in Boston, sitting in on one of my surgeries after getting special permission and making me incredibly nervous. Afterward, he told me it was the most amazing thing he'd ever seen. "You held someone's heart in your hands," he said, his voice full of wonder. "You fixed it. You saved their life." "It's what I do," I said, embarrassed by his praise, but also, I had to admit, loving it. He also changed his will, not to give me more money, but to split everything equally between Natalie and me. "I was wrong before," he told me when he informed me of the change. "Dead wrong. You've contributed just as much to this family as your sister, just in different ways." Natalie, to her credit, didn't protest. She'd seen the change in our father too, and it had affected her. She started calling me more, asking about my life, actually listening to the answers. "I never really understood what Dad did to you," she admitted during one call. "I thought you were being overdramatic. But watching him now, seeing how different he is, I realize he must have been pretty terrible before." "He was," I said honestly. "But people can change." "I'm sorry I didn't see it," she said quietly. "I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you." "You were doing what you thought was right, and we're okay now. That's what matters." 6 months after my father's surgery, I completed my residency. The ceremony was smaller than medical school, just a formal acknowledgement that we'd finished the program and were now board-eligible attending surgeons. My parents came, both of them. They sat in the front row, my father looking healthier than I'd seen him in years, my mother beaming. Natalie came too, with her husband and kids. When they called my name, Dr. Maya Reeves, specializing in cardiac surgery, my father stood up and applauded, not politely, but loudly, enthusiastically, like he was at a sporting event. Other people looked over, and he didn't care. He kept clapping until I'd crossed the stage and returned to my seat, my face burning with embarrassment and joy. Afterward, at the reception, he pulled me aside. He said, "I want to do this again." "Do what?" "Your medical school graduation. I want a do-over. I want to show up for you the way I should have the first time." I laughed, wiping away tears. "Dad, you can't redo the past."
"I know," he said, "but I can be different in the present. So I'm asking you, will you walk me through that day again? Tell me about the ceremony, about what you felt, about what you wish I'd said." We sat down and I did. I told him everything, the nervousness, the pride, the devastation when he'd called me a failure. He listened to all of it, crying openly, apologizing over and over. When I finished, he said, "Maya, I am so incredibly proud of you. You graduated from one of the best medical schools in the world despite having a father who didn't support you. You became a surgeon despite me telling you that you couldn't. You are brilliant and talented, and you save lives. You are the opposite of a failure. You are extraordinary." The words I'd needed to hear 5 years ago finally came, and they were everything I'd imagined. "Thank you, Dad," I whispered. He hugged me tightly. "Thank you for giving me another chance." A year after my father's surgery, I was an attending cardiac surgeon at Mass General, working under Dr. Harrison. I'd already performed dozens of successful surgeries, building a reputation as one of the rising stars in cardiac surgery. My father came to visit often, sometimes just sitting in the hospital cafeteria reading while I worked. "I like being close to you," he'd explained once. "Even if we're not talking, just knowing you're here, saving lives, makes me happy." One Saturday, I had a complex case, a 54-year-old man with triple vessel disease, almost identical to my father's case. The surgery was scheduled for early morning. My father showed up at 6 a.m. with coffee. "What are you doing here?" I asked, surprised. "I wanted to be here," he said simply. "You're about to do what Dr. Harrison did for me. I wanted to support you." I was so touched I almost couldn't speak. "Dad, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to. I'm your father, and I'm proud of you, and I want to be here." So he sat in the waiting room while I scrubbed in. The surgery took 6 hours, and it was flawless. Every graft was perfect. When I closed the chest and watched the patient's heart beating strong and steady beneath the sternum, I felt that familiar surge of satisfaction. Another life saved, another family that wouldn't lose someone they loved. When I came out to update the patient's family, my father was still there, waiting. When I finished talking to the family, he stood and applauded right there in the waiting room, not caring who saw. "My daughter," he told a confused nurse. "She's a heart surgeon. She just saved that man's life." The nurse smiled. "You must be very proud." "I am," he said, looking at me with tears in his eyes. "I'm the proudest father in the world." And this time, I believed him. People ask me sometimes if I regret the years I lost with my father, if I wish things had been different from the start. The answer is complicated. Yes, I wish I'd had a father who supported me from the beginning, who celebrated my achievements instead of dismissing them, who made me feel valued and loved. But I also know that those difficult years made me who I am. They made me resilient. They made me determined. They made me fight for my dreams, even when the person who should have been my biggest supporter was my biggest critic. And in the end, I got something rare, a second chance. My father's heart attack gave him a second chance at life, and it gave us a second chance at a relationship. Not everyone gets that. He's in his 70s now, healthy and active, doing everything his doctors tell him to do because, as he says, "I want to be around to see you at the top of your field." I'm not at the top yet, but I'm building toward it. Every surgery, every life saved, every complicated case solved. And now, when I doubt myself, when the pressure gets intense, I remember my father's words. "You are extraordinary." The little girl who wanted her father's approval finally has it. But more importantly, the woman I became knows she never needed it to succeed. I'm Dr. Maya Reeves, cardiac surgeon. I hold hearts in my hands and bring them back to life. And I'm nobody's failure. I'm extraordinary, all on my own. If you've ever been told you weren't good enough and proved them wrong, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice, redemption, and standing up for yourself.